Welcome to the Midwest photo review of the all-new Sigma 56mm contemporary lens. This is a new lens from Sigma that rounds out a pre-existing lineup of theirs of these 16 and 30mm contemporary lenses. This is a mirrorless specific lens, so it will only be available in Sony E mount and micro four thirds. And further than that, it only covers APS-C and Super 35 or smaller sensors. So if you have an A6000, A6300, or A6500, or even a video camera like the FS5 or FS7, this lens is going to work great. If you want to use it on an A7S, A7R, or A7, you will have to enter the Super 35 or APS-C crop mode for this lens to really work properly. Like I said, this is part of a sort of pre-existing lineup of theirs with the 16 and 30mm, and I will talk about that a little bit more later, but it's definitely a worthy addition to it, and I had pretty high hopes for this lens just being one of Sigma's newer lenses. Their contemporary lenses always perform great. So let's go ahead and look at some images and I'll show you what I found. The 56mm is a really actually amazing performer, and I was pretty blown away after these tests that I did with it. I did a couple different things just to get a sense of exactly how this lens performs in different aspects, and the first thing I did was just a pretty boring flat surface test to see how, in a more perfect environment, the lens handles things like vignetting and sharpness. And as you can see in this first image, wide open at 1.4, the lens is better than I expected it to be. There is some vignetting and some loss of sharpness towards the corners, but honestly, for what it is, not even being one of their higher end art series lenses, I think this thing handled it great. Of course, if you stop down a little bit, those issues disappear pretty much entirely, but that is to be expected. But right from the start, I think this lens was surprisingly good. The first real world test that I did with it was just to shoot some simple natural light portraits outside. And this is, I think, how most people are going to use the lens. It is very much a portrait lens. It gives a much tighter field of view on a crop sensor. And again, it didn't really disappoint. I ended up using Sony's face detect autofocus system that the A6500 has for all these tests. And that, of course, helped a lot. Because these are all portraits, I just sort of left that on the whole time, and it's really sharp. You can see in all these different images, the focus was pretty accurate, and the background is actually pretty pleasing. It isn't distracting with any really crazy out of focus character or anything, but works really well for this sort of thing. And also the vignetting, again, is really well controlled, so you can shoot wide open without having to worry about doing too much to correct any of these images after the fact, which I really appreciated, because that does just kind of eat up time, especially if you have a large number of images from like a wedding or an event or something like that. You're just getting good stuff right out of the camera, which is awesome. The second real world test that I did with it was to go shoot some studio style images. This is, of course, a little less difficult, but I think it's still important because a lot of people like to use a longer focal length for studio stuff, headshots especially. So again, I used the face detect autofocus for this just because they were portraits, and I found that with the Sony cameras that typically works best. And this, of course, being a more perfect environment, really shows off just how sharp this lens is. And I'll just flip through a couple different images that I shot here, and you can see that the focus is great. Again, the out of focus transition is really nice, so you can, it doesn't feel very extreme, nothing is distracting. It's really kind of a pleasing look, and if I crop in a little bit tighter, you can see just how much detail this lens actually resolves. So I think you could make really big prints out of this thing and crop around a lot if you needed to, because there is just so much sharpness to work with that I don't think you're going to lose much, if anything, or rather you're taking really full advantage of the sensor of your camera just because of how good this lens is. Now, there was one aspect of the lens that I found to be not so great, and it's flare. So after I took those images outside, I just kind of wandered around trying to find a good way to test this. And fortunately, the sun was peeking out a little bit. So I looked up towards the sun and found this wreath that was hanging on a light post, and decided to shoot a couple images just to see if I could get the thing to really do something with the flare and see just, how the lens performed. And in this first image, you can see that it's not great. Fortunately, there are no extreme streaks or, there's no real flare, so to speak, but there are some pretty nasty side effects from having, the sun pointing directly into the lens. And that would be the lack of, or I should say the loss of contrast and loss of saturation that you can see in the darker areas of the wreath. Now, I took 2 or 3 steps to my left and shot the same image just now with the sun blocked out, and you can see that the saturation and contrast has really come back into the image just to give you kind of a side-by-side to see how it performs with and without that light source shining directly into the lens. This is kind of an extreme example of this, so I don't know if this is something that you would really run into all the time. I think it sort of might not. This might disqualify it from being a landscape lens, because a lot of people do like to have the sun directly in their frame pretty frequently. So at some angles, this might cause some issues, and occasionally things like this can be kind of hard to fix with editing. Just that lack of contrast from the flare might take just a little bit more finesse. So something to be aware of. If you're a portrait shooter, you probably won't ever notice this, but it was something that I was kind of disappointed with, just having seen how much better some of the art series lenses handle this. But again, it's a minor gripe considering how good every other part of the lens really is. Not so surprisingly, the lens is really accurate. Unfortunately, it's not the fastest thing ever. And I did one test that really, I think, kind of accentuates this a lot. And I just basically had our model walk towards myself in the camera while we were outside doing those portraits. And basically using the continuous autofocus, you can really see where the lens struggles here. Now, I used 2 different focus modes on this first set of images where she walks towards me. This was just the camera picking a focus point based on what it thinks is best. And unfortunately, really hardly any of these are in focus. It didn't hunt a whole lot. It just wasn't very fast and didn't keep up with her. Now, for the second set of images, I had her just walk towards me again. I switched back over to the face detect autofocus that we'd used for everything else. And this actually performed pretty well. It did miss a couple of the images towards the middle, but several of the images right out of the gate, and actually a lot of them as she got closer and closer, were in really good sharp focus. It's just definitely not something I would want to use for any sort of indoor sports or really anything fast. You might have a hard time with. I'm not sure you'd be able to get quite what you're looking for without doing a lot of kind of trial and error, and maybe even just shooting more images than you think you might need. If you're looking for something that's really super fast focusing, this might not be the greatest thing for those fast moving subjects. Again, for portraits and things like that, it's gonna work just fine in my experience with all the other stuff that I shot. And even with these images of the model walking towards the camera, I wouldn't hesitate to use this lens at all. This was mostly just to kind of show, again, as a torture test, where this lens does start to, show some issues, but it's just something to be aware of. The 56mm is a super small lens. Here it is next to the A6500, and you can see that it's really not all that much taller. If I go ahead and put it onto the A6500, one of my favorite things really about the 56 while I used it was because it is as light as it is, it balances really well on the camera. So it's a comfortable shooting experience. It doesn't feel really front heavy or really back heavy. And if I was gonna shoot long term with this, or just for a long time during one day, I don't think this would hurt your hand too much or would break your back if you were gonna carry it around on a strap. Now, the lens only weighs about 280 grams. As I said, it's pretty light. That's just over half a pound. So if you're traveling, I think it's gonna make a really good option because you're getting a really high quality lens that doesn't take up a lot of space in your bag and also doesn't add a lot of weight. A lot of flights, depending on where you're going or how you're getting there, have a lot of weight restrictions, and photography equipment usually weighs a lot and takes up a lot of space. So this is a nice exception to that. And if that's something that you do pretty frequently, I would highly recommend taking a look at the 56. That might be a reason that a lot of people end up picking it up. For me, it would just be the sharpness, but the size is just such an awesome added bonus. Just to wrap up, the only other thing that I really want to mention is the other lens that I have currently from that series, which is the 30mm 1.4. They're really close in size, and so I just talked about how small and lightweight the 56 is. The 30mm, while larger but only slightly, is really similar to it, and I think just a great addition. And if you wanted to get the whole set of the 16, 30, and 56, you just have such a powerful kind of triplet on your hands that would really let you do just about anything. And like the 30mm and 16mm, the 56 is just an awesome performer. Like I said so many times, I was really blown away by this lens. The flare was the only thing that, you know, was weird to it. Again, because it might be missing some lens coatings or things like that. I guess it's to be expected. The lens is $479, which you know, isn't the most inexpensive lens that you could get for the Sony system, but it's certainly nowhere near the most expensive lens. And I think for that price, the lens just performs so well. And I think I would definitely be able to overlook some things like that flare and maybe the focus being a little bit slower in certain aspects. So just such a great lens. And I think if you're considering a longer focal length, like any of the 50mm lenses for the Sony system, or if you already have the 16 and 30mm, definitely give this thing a look and stop by Midwest and maybe pick it up for rental, or just stop in and put it on your camera and see what you think about it. I think you will be pretty pleasantly surprised. This has been Midwest Photo Review of the Sigma 56mm E-mount contemporary lens. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.